Well, in today's episode, I'm excited to have with me Dr. Scot McKnight. How are you doing, Scott?
Doing well, Eric. Good to see you. I see you still have the same kind of haircut that I have.
You know, I shaved my head at 26 and I've looked the same ever since. It never grew back. Well, it's good to see
Oh,
you. I loved our times together as part of the Origins Project, you and me and Margaret Feinberg and Dan Kimball. And I know
yeah,
you've continued when a new project with Dan, or at least did for a while there. And as a
yeah.
professor and historian, a New Testament theologian, you've also had, I think, a great pulse on what God is doing in the American church. I'd love to hear on this post-Christian podcast. We're really trying to help people know how to reach this post-Christian world, increasingly
hmm
post-Christian. What are some of the things you've been seeing from your vantage point that would be helpful for church leaders?
Um, I often look at what's going on in the United States in so you call it the post-Christian environment. I look at the early church and I think, how did in the world did they impact their local communities? You think of the book of Romans and the significance of that letter. And there appears to be five separate households in Romans chapter 16. And most of these households, according to the really good scholars about households, would say somewhere between 15 and 30 people.
Hmm.
So here you have maybe 150 people. I think Tom Wright says maybe 200. I'm not quite sure.
Hmm.
But not very many people. And yet the gospel moved from Rome through the whole world
Hmm.
in different ways. And how did they do that? And I think this is something that I think we can learn from is those early Christians who had no social power, had no status in that sense that their religion was going to be respected, whose religion actually was not even accepted by most people as even legitimate. How did they do it? Well, they lived the way of Jesus. They followed him. They didn't presume on anybody or anything. In fact, they were very candid, almost secretive at times about how they communicated things. They didn't really, we got the Apostle Paul stand on the Areopagus in Athens, apparently preaching. Well, it's not quite that simple, but that's not what the normal kind of evangelism was. They participated in evangelism in their own families. They catechized or taught people how to follow Jesus. And over time, there was a critical mass, enough people who were walking in the way of Jesus in a consistent way that view became compelling. And I feel like we're many times back in that position. One of the things I think we have going for us, Eric, our friend Dan Kimball, I think called his book this. They don't like the church, but they love Jesus.
Mhm.
I find this to be very interesting. There's a really interesting study. I put it at the back of a book I wrote called Blue Parakeet. And in that study, we discover that people like Jesus. They want to be like him. They even make themselves sound like him, or they make him sound like themselves. It doesn't matter. They want to be like Jesus. And I think that's the best thing we have going for us. And maybe that's where we should start right there with the post-Christian world is say, what do you think of Jesus? What do you think of what he says about the kingdom? What about his view of wealth, etc.? What do you think of Jesus?
Yeah, that's such a great reminder. Blue Parakeet's one of my favorites. I've bought so many copies of that, handed it up to women who were
Yeah,
called to ministry, those who are
yeah.
struggling with that issue. You're so prolific, and there's just, I mean, Jesus created another one. Maybe folks are familiar with, but you've been writing a lot over the years, even on your website, about kind of the healthy version of what the church should look like. Which, by the way, if you guys have not been to his website, I highly recommend you subscribing and going to scotmcknight.substack.com, and just all the wealth of materials or even following you on social media. Talk about some of what you're seeing, even when it comes to what was popular or maybe even effective in the 80s and 90s and aughts, but
Yeah,
what you're seeing that's more effective now, and
yeah.
what kind of keep going into that conversation there.
You know, I'm not sure I know what's effective anymore. Um, in a sense that, there was a time, and you brought this up, in the 80s and 90s, those mega churches, you could tell how effective it was because the way they measured everything. They'd bring in Randy Travis, and he'd sing on the platform, or they'd bring in some football star and he'd talk on the platform and give his testimony. And then they measured how many people believed in Jesus and got baptized, and how many people came and how much money was given. There was sort of a ready-made metric for what worked and what didn't. I think those days are over. And I think what we have to do is reduce our expectations for, let's say, measurable metrics, that sort of thing, and start becoming more faithful, more focused on Jesus, and over time, seeing what that's going to do for almost like a decade experiment in faithfulness, in living the way of Jesus, the way of the cross. I'm working on the Gospel of Mark right now, and let's just see what becomes of this. That's the early Christians didn't measure results. They didn't even have metrics for things like this. They didn't know what worked. But here they woke up 30 years later and they thought, there's 400 people now connected to our group, and it's pretty cool.
Well, I appreciate that heart too, because ultimately, the people you love, are they finding faith? Are they moving towards faith? Are you faithfully living what it means to be a follower of Jesus? You've tackled one of the hardest books in the Bible, Revelation, and a new book, Revelation for the Rest of Us. I cannot wait to get my copy. I feel like this has been one of those books that has been misinterpreted, misused, abused, and in many ways done a lot of damage. Some of the books written about Revelation over the years. I can't wait to hear and read what you've right-sized for us in this. But talk about what even made you want to write about Revelation. I know you are a New Testament scholar. Maybe it's in your PhD, you have to. But my guess is you had a heart towards it. What kind of led you towards it? And then I want to hear more about what someone could get from this exciting book.
Yeah. Well, I grew up and I came of age as a Christian, began to be a faithful follower of Jesus in the 70s. At that time, my view of the book of Revelation was shaped by what I call speculation in dispensationalism. So in our church, not many people talked about Hal Lindsey, the late great Planet Earth. I was told about a book by Salem Kurban, who had a long book called 666. Pretty clever, eh? And then he had another book, Guide to, I think it's called Your Guide to Survival or Guide to Survival. It was supposedly written for people who would not be raptured, and they would find this book and they would be able to make sense of what's going on in the world.
Well, that's very compassionate.
and so I grew up with this, and the whole thing, I like to say it this way, Eric, is that what we read the book of Revelation for was to figure out who in our modern world was doing what was done by a figure in the book of Revelation. So was it at my time, was it just after Stalin? Was it Nikita Khrushchev? Was it Gorbachev with his birthmark, which was some people? I heard people talk about Warren Kissinger. So it was just one person after another, but it was Israel becoming a nation in 1948 that electrified so many people who believed in this speculation approach to the book of Revelation, is that they were always speculating about who in the modern world fit what was described in the book of Revelation.
Mhm.
Well, I was into that. And then I started studying the Bible more carefully and learning some tools and learning the languages and reading good scholars. And I sort of made my break with dispensationalism when I became a post-tribber in college. I read
Okay.
Robert
Right.
Gundry, The Church in the Tribulation, and I changed. And I had friends, pastors and people who thought I had kind of lost my faith. And I thought, oh my goodness. Well, then when I was in seminary, I began to dabble with Jewish apocalyptic literature. In my PhD, I read everything published at the time in apocalyptic literature.
Wow.
And by the time and I didn't even write about this for my PhD, I read all that material. As I read that material, I thought this is the way the book of Revelation works. And then, you have to tie it to Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, etc. All that stuff works. But I began to understand how Jewish apocalyptic literature worked. And then I read some major books on Jewish apocalyptic. When I finished my dissertation, say Christopher Rowland's famous book, The Open Heaven. And I just, at that time, I'm talking now the early, let's say late 80s. I just thought the way these speculation people were reading the book of Revelation was totally wrong. They were missing everything, that it needed to be read more. And I often tell my students this, Eric, you have kids enough to know that. I think it's more like Morris Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are and the Chronicles of Narnia than it is like the way these people are using it to predict.
Yeah.
So you have to have imagination.
Yeah.
You have to let these images take you where they go, and you have to have a sense for those images, like a dragon chasing a woman and all these things happening. And if you don't like the imagery, you're going to miss everything. But if you like it and let it be what it is, it'll remind you and teach you of the sorts of things the book of Revelation is talking about. So
That's beautiful.
I taught Jesus classes most of the time, most of my career. When I went to Northern Seminary 10 years ago, I began to teach Paul, first time in my life. I'd always read Paul, of course, but I also taught the book of Revelation every now and then for like one lecture. And a few years ago, I was talking to a student who said, I'd like you to teach a course on Revelation. I said, well, I won't be ready by the time you take your last class, but I'm going to do this. So I sent him a copy the other day of his book.
Great.
I said, I wrote this book because of you, Greg. His name is Greg Mamula. He's a wonderful pastor.
That's awesome.
So I wanted to put together how I was reading the book of Revelation. And I had a wonderful student at the time who was very advanced, Cody Matchett. And he worked on certain projects in the book, and I worked on others. And we put our minds together and we came up with Revelation for the rest of us.
Love it. Well, I think so much of what the Bible Project has done, other scholars have done to remind us we're supposed to read the text the way it was intended. It was written to other people, like understanding the context of what was written and to whom can then help us learn how to apply it. So when someone comes up to you, and you'll probably get this on your book tour and when you're signing books, so when is the last day? How do you respond when people are asking, are we in the end times? Because it's seeped in our culture, even outside of Christians who follow Jesus.
Oh, yes.
They are watching the news, and there's a checklist they're looking at. How do you help people navigate that? Because I do think it creates an opportunity for us to reach out with people who are living in fear. How do you answer that question?
I got to tell you a story. One of the great scholars still alive in the world today, I won't tell you his name, I don't want to put him on the spot, was at a reception at an academic meeting, and a friend of mine who really is into eschatology sort of as a lay person says to this scholar, what's your view of the millennium? Are you pre-mill, post-mill? And the scholar just looked at him and he went, I have no idea what you're talking about. because that's not what happens in technical scholarship on the book of Revelation.
Interesting.
Well, here's what I would say to someone who has a little bit of fear of the book of Revelation. So the book of Revelation is actually designed to remove fear. It is designed for 7 house churches in Western Asia Minor at the time, are Turkey. So cities are still there. And there's some marvelous archaeological sites there. It was written to those 7 churches in a couple ways. Number one, to tell them they got to quit letting Rome, Babylon in the book of Revelation, have an impact in their local churches. And the second thing it's saying, someday, Babylon, Rome, the empires of this world are going to be brought to their knees. Injustice is going to be disestablished. Bloodshed is going to end. Exploitation of other people's wealth is going to end and stop. And justice and peace and wisdom and love are going to be established in the world. God is going to make this happen. It's not going to happen through bloodshed. It's not going to happen through war. It's not going to be happening through nuclear warheads. It's going to be happened by the sword that comes out of the Lamb's mouth, which is the word of God. And that is going to be the weapon, as it were. What a weapon it is. It's an anti-weapon. It's going to be the anti-weapon of God's choice that will bring justice and eliminate evil and injustices in the world. And so there's a hope in the book of Revelation that someday God is going to bring justice. And there's also a warning, don't be a part of the problem. I have a friend who one time told me, here's my 3-point outline to the book of Revelation. He's from Texas. He's from Abilene, Texas. Randy Harris. He said, God's team wins. Choose your team. Don't be stupid. That's his. I said, that's pretty close to what the book of Revelation is saying. And it is. It is saying, don't follow the way of the Lamb if you want to live in the New Jerusalem. If you want to experience, the lake of fire as sort of the final place of everything being extinguished. Yeah. If you want to follow that way, follow the way of Rome. Economic exploitation, injustice, sexual violence, opulence, war, murder, etc., arrogance.
Well, and the beauty of what you're describing is, the Christian faith should change how we live and how the church is supposed to be bringing more of heaven to earth. Like it kind of, even just in that simple explanation you gave us, it kind of breaks down the fight between, are we supposed to change the person? Or are we supposed to change the environment? And I think the answer is yes. Some focus just on the individual salvation to the neglect of society and its ills, and others have focused just on society and forgetting the message of Jesus, the gospel. Talk about as you described, 7 real churches were receiving this letter, and each had something that the Lord both affirmed and rebuked. What are some of the other things that this church, our church, the church in America, can learn from the book of Revelation?
Well, as I was talking earlier about this old-fashioned dispensational approach that leads to speculation, it also leads to sort of a Christian life of escape. And it leads to the notion that if we read this book right, we'll realize we're not going to be there. So let's not worry about it. And that completely fails the book. The book is actually a manual of discipleship.
Wow.
Teaching people what it means to follow the Lamb, the way of Jesus, the cross, in a world that is against them and where they're the minority voice. And a lot of us feel minority voices in a lot of settings. Mm-hmm. And I would say if people don't, they need to get out of the church building more often. Yeah. Because there's a lot of this in our world today. And as a result, I think the book of Revelation, I call it a theopolitical manual.
Mm.
And that is, it teaches us divine politics. It teaches us, number one, how to discern the presence of Babylon in our world. So there's a slogan that my publisher put on a couple keychains that they sent out to some influencers that says Babylon is timeless. Well, that's in our book. We say Babylon is timeless. Babylon is not some just Rome in the first century, and it's not some future city, Moscow, or Rome, or whatever, whatever you don't like, Dallas, L.A. That misreads it all. Babylon was a trope in the Jewish world. It was used for all the empires of the world that were against the people of God. So Babylon is timeless. And the book of Revelation, we teach our students that they have to begin reading the book of Revelation with chapter 17, not chapter 1. The first Christians didn't have to worry about that because chapter 17 was their living reality. It's not our living reality. And in that chapter, we learn characteristics of Babylon, that they're against the God of the Bible. They're so into opulence. They will put to death. I was just reading the story of Gaius Caligula, the emperor, let's say in about the 40s in Rome. When he became the emperor and took control, he killed like 140,000 people. That's the Rome that the first century Christians knew about. They were into their image all the time. It was always about image. There were divine, there were images of gods and goddesses. Roma was everywhere. It was militaristic. They went and conquered a country and they called it peace. We would call it domination, oppression, and violence. They exploited other countries and other places so that if they needed wheat, they went and conquered a city that was full of wheat. If they needed grapes, they went to Italy, or to Greece. And when they needed yogurt, when they needed hummus, they knew where to go. And they just brought all these ships are coming into Rome up the Tiber River, unloading all these goods because of exploitation. And ultimately they were arrogant. And when you begin to study Revelation 17, it bleeds into chapter 18. Then you get to the churches, 7 churches in Revelation 2-3. You suddenly realize that what is happening in those churches is sort of the invasion, the steady drip, drip, drip of the Roman Empire beginning to make itself felt in those churches. And what John wanted them to see is not, in a sense, to go back to our earlier, what's going to be effective in leading these people to Christ. He wanted them to say, this is not the way we live. If we're going to follow Jesus, and ultimately thousands and myriads in the book of Revelation are worshiping the Lamb. And it's an amazing scene for those who lived in those little house churches in Western Asia Minor. Is they realize that we can't live like this. This is not the way to follow the Lamb. So it's a discipleship that teaches us to follow the Lamb. It's a discipleship that teaches us not to follow the way of Rome. But there are 2 other major categories for those who want to follow Jesus in Revelation. They have to be, third, they have to be witnesses. And to be a witness is to tell the world or others what you saw and felt and experienced. So you are a witness of something. You're like you're in a courtroom. What did you see on that street corner? That's what they do. But that kind of witness many times puts a person's life on the line. So the word for witness, martus, in the book of Revelation becomes the word martyr in early Christianity. Now, the fourth thing they have to learn to do is worship. There are songs in the book of Revelation. They're amazing songs. And many people call them hymns. But an African-American scholar, and he wasn't alone in this, his name is Bryant. He made the contention, and he totally convinced me, that these songs in the book of Revelation are more like spirituals in the African-American tradition than like our hymns. Our hymns are sort of cool. We play organs and pianos and we have all these notes, and I don't know a thing about music. My mother was a musician, but I didn't pick it up. And these are songs that when you sing them, you might think of singing them according to the rhythms of the spirituals, but if you're paying attention, they are as much a sabotage or a subversion of the Roman Empire, with a little wink and a nod at the end of lines, than they are just straightforward songs of praise. They are that, but they are amazing acts of subversion. The believers in Western Asia Minor who sang these songs were being resistant and dissidents in the Roman Empire. They were subverting.
Wow. Love it. Well, thank you, Scot, for taking the time to share a little bit more about this new work. I'm super excited. Some of those of you who get my newsletter will get a free copy. You can sign up for that newsletter at my website, ericbryant.org. Revelation for the rest of us. Scot, thank you so much for what you do to advance the kingdom. We're grateful for you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Great to see you again.
You too.